For 3 days the rain has fallen, unceased, unrelenting. For 3 days it's kept Gotham citizens under cover and indoors. It's better they stay there, because for 3 days, Gotham City has run red with blood. An entire criminal enterprise built around the sale of tiny innocents has vanished. All traces of its existence have literally been swept away. The media in Gotham City has been kicked up into the frenzy over the disappearance of a young, pregnant teenager named Cassie Wells. The affair has Penguin in a panic, and he's made a deal with Mr. Freeze to work with a cleaning crew to go around to all avenues of the operation in order to sterilize it. They've been traveling to every place involved in the operation of this underground network. The attorney's office involved in the affair, the free clinic they were using on the East End, and 4 women's shelters, all successfully sanitized with impunity. The trouble started at the 5th site. Freeze and the gang proceeded as usual, without much difficulty. Until they heard a noise from the other room. Freeze went to go check on the matter, only to discover a very young woman, likely a teenager. Alarmed, Penguin asks if it was Cassie Wells, but his man Tony is unable to confirm who was involved. Whatever Freeze saw when he came in from the other room, he suddenly had a far more serious look on his face. When the cleaning crew suggested they dispose of her like the others, he attacked them, freezing them all on the spot and leaving them for dead, while he left with the girl. Penguin sighs but isn't surprised. This is what happens when you work with the freaks, and demands that they shut down the Iceberg Lounge for renovations while they triple the guard. The last thing he needs is for the friends to think they've lost control. Penguin's assistant Jessica remarks the guard has already been tripled, and Penguin orders her to triple it again, and asks if they have another crew at the shelter before he shows up. Unfortunately for Cobblepot, Batman is there right now. The Dark Knight has been chasing the lead down for this underground network that has been kidnapping young women, killing them, and selling off their children. Batman discovers the whereabouts of one of these babies, who has been adopted by a wealthy couple. When the Dark Knight approaches the woman, she runs away terrified, saying she has nothing to say on the matter or circumstances of her son's adoption. As she panically runs away from the terrifying superhero, Batman leaves, having set up a bug on her apartment, and says that they'll wait for the husband to return home in order to discover exactly what happened. He has Tim Drake stay behind and watch for his return. Not long after this, when the husband returns home, the woman at first greets him warmly before she discovers the man in front of her is not actually her husband, instead a stranger wearing a remarkably accurate mask. In front of a very caught off guard Robin, the strange man shoots the woman dead. At the shelter, Batman is able to discover the identity of the person behind this cover-up and all this business going on with this shady operation, the man behind it all. A man that Batman has let roam in his city far too long, Oswald Cobblepot. Back at the Iceberg Lounge, the Penguin begins to panic. Somebody has firebombed his steakhouse, and he hasn't heard back from one of his men, while another of his men are holed up at the wharf and wants to know what to do. The Penguin finds himself at the end of his rope. Someone is destroying his operation, and he doesn't have anyone left to do anything about it. Suddenly, the Iceberg Lounge is under attack. Penguin begins to fume. There shall be a reckoning when he gets his hands on whoever's behind this. He will twist and snap their necks like the scrawny little weasels they are. Tony, who suddenly changes his demeanor, asks why Cobblepot would want to do that. They're his friends. When the strange man attempts to shoot Cobblepot, Jessica pulls out a pistol and shoots the man in the head. Penguin is baffled when the gunshot reveals a head full of dirt, but is dismayed when he hears a sound.
Hello
welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and this is my recap and review for Detective Comics number 803. So we're almost done our little mini-series of the 12 days of Detective Comics. At this point, I'm recording deep enough into this thing that I've been able to see the reviews and replies to it for the majority of this series, and I gotta say, they've mostly been positive. I'm glad everybody's been enjoying this because I've enjoyed it too. It's really fun going through it completely randomly, because we just jump into stuff by complete coincidence, and we go from random issues that aren't the automatic top shelf best of the best Detective Comics things that people tend to look at when they're looking back on this series. And it's kind of interesting because of that. Here we are in the early 2000s with a sort of prelude tie-in comic to the big Batman event known as War Games. And yeah, it's kind of interesting. I remember War Games. We're at the point deep enough in Detective Comics history that not only am I alive for the publication, which thus far has only happened once in the last episode when we were talking about the annual, but I was also pretty much an active comic book reader at this point, and do remember the War Games story and hearing about it and eventually reading it myself. It's not perfect, it is lacking a certain flair and thing that made No Man's Land really memorable in comparison, but it had some really interesting ideas to it, and had some pretty cool stuff going on overall. I really like Stephanie Brown's character, and it was kind of cool seeing things go wrong for her. I understand some people are upset about all that, they feel her character was fringed and stuff. I'm not going to get into all of that right now, I have mixed feelings about all of that too. But the War Games story itself was really interesting. It reminds me a lot of Death in the Family, where Batman essentially lets something happen, not on purpose, but he's unable to prevent something where one of his potential proteges really screws up and ultimately pays heavily for it. And the Dark Knight in turn internalizes that and has to deal with that outcome. This comic is very different from the ones we reviewed so far. Even the Chuck Dixon 1990s comic, which was very serious, dealing with Batman traveling through a war zone and rescuing hostages, many of which he knew personally. This comic feels like it's even a step farther in the direction of a darker take on Batman. We are in what I think is going to be referred to in terms of Batman history as the Dark Knight era, where we were getting into the Nolan movies. We weren't quite there yet, but we're clearly heading in that direction, and you can see where they came from out of comics like these. Batman, in the first page of this comic, basically threatens to torture a guy, and we're not even dealing with a war zone situation here. It's just some criminal in Gotham City. Now, mind you, as we discover in this comic, it's to discover what's going on behind these young women being kidnapped and murdered so that their babies can be harvested. Obviously, that's a bit darker than what we've seen so far in any of these Detective Comics issues, so it appropriately involves Batman being significantly more aggressive than what we've seen. There's a strong, dark take on everything. Batman's got so much Jack Bauer in him in this issue that it's a little concerning. And it holds this comic back, in fact. If anything, that's the one main thing that I don't like about this comic, is how torture-heavy and aggressive Batman is. How violent everything has suddenly become. And I don't have anything wrong with the violence or anything like that. I love the Chuck Dixon comic for that very reason. But it goes a little too far, and Batman becomes borderline unlikable because he's just so aggressive and insane at some points in this comic. But then again, given what's going on, given the victims and how brutally they're being treated and what's happening here, I kind of understand his aggression. There's a sense of this brewing storm in this comic, and in fact, I really would have preferred this comic open on its second page, which is near pitch perfect, and is where we started the recap in this video, with the rain, talking about how Gotham's just been deluged lately, both in blood and water, and it's a really strong opening moment that sets the tone for the entire issue. The stuff that immediately happens before that is brutal and kind of works in establishing Batman as a character, but like I said, I feel like it goes too far, and it dates this comic. It feels like immediately we're dealing with a post-9/11 era comic, and thus it will always read like that. When we look at the more modern Batman comics that have happened since then, this character is lightened up ever so slightly. They're dealing with less mature content to a degree and focusing more on different stuff. At least that's my overall opinion. Batman's still a dark character, we haven't compromised away from that, but this feels like it goes so far in that direction that it's almost at the disservice of the storytelling. That being said, I really like this brutal story, and I love that this is all about the Penguin. And a lot of this comic is told from the Penguin's perspective, even as we're talking about him just casually murdering dozens of innocent people. He's a brutal villain in this comic, and that I love. For all the stuff I've said about the dark themes and all that, making your villain out to be dark isn't wrong at all, and can work in giving your hero purpose and drive. The Penguin feels like a real menace here, and should actually be taken seriously for once, which I adore. And this comic is full of a lot of really interesting details. David Lapham does the writing and the layout of this comic, and it really shows. He has a very interesting way of telling this story. A lot of this comic goes, and is the way that the story is told is out of order. Not in a overly stylistic Memento style, but in a way that is unfolding and explaining the plot to the reader, while also telling us a little bit more about what's going on in the story and the overall setting of Gotham City and war games. It's very clever in that regard. We jump around a lot of time with Batman having arrived at the safe house and us then going back and seeing what it took to get him to that point. In doing so, it allows us to really have a lot of this story not focus on Batman, but more so the Penguin and his perspective of the events. He knows a lot more than Batman, and as we, the reader, do at first as well, and that is interesting. Meanwhile, there's this crazy guy actually actively working against the Penguin and using what I would assume would be some sort of Clayface-based stuff to disguise his appearance as various people in order to do that. And that ending of this issue is really good. Obviously, all that stuff is going to be continued. Obviously, this isn't the end of the Penguin's character, but that's a big moment for us to close this issue out on, and a really strong one at that. We are officially well past the point of standalone Batman stories in Detective Comics, and now we're getting into longer, sequential storytelling, and thus this is part 3 of that overall War Games prelude. But I have to tell you, given that I didn't read these prelude comics when I originally read War Games, given that I've never read this story before, I found it stood alone all on its own just fine. I understood what was going on, and the comic explained enough that I was easily able to stay intrigued by these events and didn't need to read the first 2 parts of this horror show story. It works all on its own in that regard, and that's a very good thing, because when you're in the future randomly reading through comics, one would expect that these comics should, at least to a degree, stand on their own, and to a degree explain enough to the reader that they have a sense of what's going on, even if they don't have the full picture and would need to read more before and after in order to do so. You are all more than welcome to do that, but that's not the spirit and nature of what we're doing here. And if you want to know what happens on War Games, you can very easily look it up. I gave enough hints about that to begin with. Nevertheless, the things I like about War Games are here too. The focus on non-top shelf Batman villains is great. I like the Penguin, and it's cool that we have a story about him in our 12 Days of Detective Comics. We are honestly lucky in that regard. We have done 2 Joker stories, but that's not unusual. The Joker is present throughout all of Batman history and is a constant recurring theme. The lesser-known villains, the ones that are still very popular and have been villains in movies and all of that, but tend not to be focused as much in the comics or in adaptations of Batman stories, are cool, and it's always a treat when we get to see more of them. The Penguin being a strong example of that, along with characters like the Riddler or even Mr. Freeze, who does appear in this issue too, and has some pretty interesting moments as well. So it's kind of a cool comic. You can see the war brewing between all these villains and this greater plan going on here, while the story at hand is interesting enough that the comic all on its own is worth reading, independent of War Games, or even if you didn't like War Games. I would still recommend this comic because it's different, it's interesting, and it might offer something that you didn't see before. So, that's that. Definitely recommend this one. Love the artwork too. I talked about that a bit here and there, but Ramon Bax does some really good penciling in this thing, and Nathan Massengel does excellent inking as well. With Jared K. Fletcher's coloring, it really shows a strong art piece overall. I love the way the Penguin is depicted in this comic. The accentuated nose and the way like he gets stuffed up is really well done. And there's little things thanks to the fact that Lapham did the art breakdowns of this comic. For example, when the Penguin is interrogating Tony along with Jessica, they're both holding umbrellas. And the reason for that is slowly revealed when the set piece of this little bird cage office Penguin has all these birds at the top on the ceiling. And they're pooping on Tony, who doesn't have an umbrella, while the other 2 are protected. And it's just a nice little artful moment that I I like. It isn't ever actually explicitly stated in the dialogue, but it's there in the artwork. That's clever storytelling and takes advantage of the nature of comic books and their ability to bridge both a verbal and visual medium. They're a unique art form in that regard, so when we see issues like this taking advantage of that, that's a very good thing. We're starting to get into more artful comics in spite of the fact that we are moving farther and farther into the modern age. As much as I do like the older Bronze, Silver, and Golden Age comics, it is a treat seeing the more artful nature of the modern age starting to creep in. As much as I generally appreciate all those older comics, and let's face it, none of these modern comics would exist without the Golden Age comics to sort of take mold and shape for all these superheroes that we know today. These modern comics really do have an aesthetic that the older ones lack. The older comics have their own aesthetic and offer a lot, especially when we remember that the technology was so much different compared to today. The coloring of older comics varied from day to day and thus from page to page based on how the inks turned out when they mixed in the different colors each day. That's cool. That's a very interesting aspect of how they worked and operated back then. But let's not pretend that those older comics are systematically somehow better than these newer ones. I really like this comic, and to be honest, it's one of the better ones we did. In spite of some dated aspects to it, on the whole, it is less dated than the other older comics we've done. And on the whole, it is much more sophisticated in its storytelling. This is still and will be our last CCA-approved comic. DC would officially step away from that sort of thing around 2011. And the final comic we'll be reviewing was published after that. Technically, it's hard to argue this comic is still intended for children at all. It's dealing with some very mature themes. But it does still follow the tenets of CCA, meaning that it avoids gore and doesn't get too explicit about everything. You have to sort of read into matters and to understand what's going on as an adult to fully understand the gravity of what's going on in this issue. So it would, to a degree, be appropriate for kids, but definitely not young children, and I would be careful about how you pose comics like these to children in general. And that's kind of part of my issue about it being potentially too dark, or at least we've gone past the point of all ages. And that might be okay for a series called Detective Comics. Perhaps Batman can be loftier and lighter, while this comic is a little more firm and edgier. But DC needs to identify that clearly, and thus this shouldn't be a CCA comic at all. And that kind of shows in a little bit of a degree. Now that we're getting so dark and serious, it contrasts itself with the self-censorship rules of the CCA. The biggest moment of that is when that dude, the fake Tony, is shot in the head and there's only dirt that shows up. That works with Clayface and stuff, but the only reason that's there is because we can't show a guy's head getting blown off in this comic. And would I want that in a Batman story? I don't know. It really depends on the type of Batman story you're telling here. But a story like this clearly is intended for mature audiences only, so the fact that it's still pulling back, the fact that it's presenting itself as an all-ages comic feels a bit incongruous with itself. So there's some tone issues here. But in spite of that, it still feels like we're leagues away from the Golden Age Batman comics I was reviewing from the 1940s and 50s. Those are historical documents. They are interesting and worth reading, but everything about this comic is better if we're being honest. 803 is interesting and very cool, and maybe part of this is because they're going full swing. We're just after a big milestone issue with 800, so obviously we've reset and started building up war games as of 801. So it's a cool and unique time in Detective Comics history because of that. Anyways, I've talked enough about all of this. It's time to move on to our final issue, the last Detective comic we'll be reviewing as part of this mini-series. It's been a really cool journey, and I'm glad you guys have joined me for it. Next up, we're going into the 2000s and 10s. Ugh, God, that's an awkward thing to say. The 2010s? There we go. Next up, we're going into the 2010s, and it's going to be an interesting time period for Batman comics overall. It means that we're entering into one of two possible eras of DC Comics, either the New 52 or Rebirth. And while Rebirth would go on to return to the Detective Comics original numbering and completely reinvent the series in a way that had never been done before, making it into a team effort of various detectives operating in and around Gotham City under Batman's leadership, the New 52 would have a very different take on Detective Comics, restarting the numbering and thus taking us into a comic that doesn't actually exist. In the early 900s in terms of issue number, but was actually given a numbering entirely different to begin with. So yeah, next up, the new 52. And all the baggage that comes with it. Thanks for watching this video. Let me know what you think in the comments section below. If you like Comic Island, be sure to check out our Patreon page. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.